Okay, a very good morning to folks in Toronto and the East Coast, and good afternoon to people in Britain. My name is Lynette Ong, Professor of Political Science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm delighted today to be hosting this webinar to discuss Professor Steve Zhang's latest book, The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, which is co-authored with Olivia Chung. Steve Zhang is director of the SOAS China Institute at SOAS University of London. He's also an emeritus fellow of St. Anthony's College at Oxford and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He previously served as the head of the School of Contemporary Chinese Studies and director of the China Policy Institute at the University of Nottingham. Before that, he spent 29 years at Oxford University, where he earned his DPhil and worked as a professor, fellow, dean, director of the Asian Studies Center at St. Anthony's College. He has a broad area of research interest and has published extensively, including 5 single-authored books and 13 collaborative books. So on that note, over to you, Steve. Really looking forward to hearing more about your thoughts on Xi Jinping.
Well, thank you very much, Lynette. Great pleasure to be here to talk to your groups at the University of Toronto at the Munk School. What I'm going to do, I hope will be spending about up to 30 minutes or so to talk about Xi Jinping thought. I'll start off by simply saying what Xi Jinping thought seeks to achieve. And that basically 2 things interlinked. One is domestically what it tries to do, and then beyond China, globally, what Xi Jinping thought is about. Now, domestically, it is about forging one China, one people, one ideology, one party, and one leader. Beyond China, globally, it is about delivering the China dream of national rejuvenation. And what does that mean? A bit more cliche here, since you are a North American audience. It is to make China great again. More specifically, what does that mean? I'll go into a lot more details later when I talk about how he wants to achieve this. It is, in general terms, to return China to the glory days of its imperial zenith, when what Xi Jinping would think of as Pax Seneca prevailed. I'll come back to more of this in terms of what it means for China as a whole and for the rest of the world in terms of what this national rejuvenation of China as Xi Jinping conceives it means. Now, how does Xi Jinping thought says that China should achieve the China dream? The book is divided into essentially 7 parts. One is to put the party at the center. As Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress, matters not whether you are in the north, south, east, west, or in the middle. Matters not whether you are in the party, state, military, civilian life, educational sector, or any other sector. The party leads everything, everywhere. No exceptions, no if, no buts. The party leads everything. And this is why, from the very beginning of Xi Jinping's time as the top leader in China, he started the anti-corruption campaign, which is what most people call an anti-corruption campaign. The only important thing that we need to bear in mind is that when it was being launched as an anti-corruption campaign, it was always meant to be something much more. A campaign has a starting point and an ending point. And it was the sort of things that people in China and the Communist Party in particular expect a new leader to come in and start something new, but give it a few months, maybe even 6 months, or, well, for a really ambitious leader, maybe a year, this will all blow over, we'll get back to normal. Except that's not what Xi Jinping intended. The anti-corruption campaign had always been an anti-corruption drive in name, but a party ratification campaign, a party ratification operation in practice. And because it is the party ratification operation in practice, it has no termination date. It's going to continue for as long as Xi Jinping is in power, and it is the sort of things that will make sure the party leader controls the party effectively, reinvigorating the Communist Party of China as a Leninist instrument of control, which was at the risk of faltering at the end of the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao decade. So this is the first important part about what Xi Jinping thought is about, putting the party at the center of everything. The second part is to combine a Maoist-typed strongman leader with an effective, reinvigorated Leninist party control. And the man in China's histories since the Communist Party who exemplified, at least until Xi Jinping came along, who exemplified the way how the Communist Party was a true Leninist instrument, was Mao Zedong's former number 2, Liu Shaoqi, the man who was famous or infamous for his little pamphlet called How to Be a Good Communist. He was the ultimate communist Leninist until Xi Jinping came along. He is all about making sure the party controls everything with very strong discipline, and the party delivers them. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, was about his charismatic leadership. Mao Zedong would, and in fact did, unleash the so-called masses against the Communist Party when he thought the Communist Party was becoming an obstacle to the fulfillment of his perpetual revolution, and that was called the Cultural Revolution. Liu Shaoqi would never do that. And where Xi Jinping comes in is that he brings the two together. He brings in the Maoist type of leadership, hence the personality cult that he's cultivating, but he crafted on top of the Liu Shaoqi's approach to Leninist party control. Sorry. So under Xi Jinping, the party takes over the state. We often in Chinese politics describe the political entity in China as a party state. But for about 4 decades in the period of the opening up and reform from Deng Xiaoping through Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, the state was coming out more and more strongly, and the party was fading more into the background. That's been reversed with under Xi Jinping. The party is coming out and becoming much more dominant in running the political system in China, and the state becomes more of an instrument for implementation rather than for policy making. And the party, in this conception, represents the collective wisdoms of the people. The party therefore knows what the people want even more than the people themselves. And the implication of this approach is that when we look at Chinese national interest in the era of Xi Jinping thought, what is Chinese national interest is essentially what fits in with the Communist Party definition of its interests, and therefore it becomes national interest. And since Xi Jinping is the core of the Communist Party, you end up with three concentric circles. You have the outer circle, which is called the national interest. You have an inside circle, which is the Communist Party's interest. And right in the middle of that Communist Party circle is the core leader, Xi Jinping himself. So what is good for Xi Jinping must be good for China. What Xi Jinping sees as in his interest is now part of China's national interests. Xi Jinping will still see the party as something he needs, and therefore he will continue to put a lot of emphasis on party discipline and control in order to keep the party in power, which means keeping himself in power. The third key element is about ideological indoctrination. So we're moving from into the one ideology dimension of it. The ideological indoctrination effectively is about making Xi Jinping thought the new state ideology of China. Now, in the book, we don't call it the state ideology, we call it a proto-ideology, because Xi Jinping thought doesn't really qualify in terms of the political science definition of what an ideology is. It doesn't actually meet all the requirements. It's not sufficiently tightly thought through. It does not have the long-term vision of what it will deliver. Xi Jinping thought, if you like, is even very bad Marxism. Even though Xi Jinping keep on saying that he is a dedicated Marxist, and his thought represents the best, most modern and fantastic rendition of Marxism. But he's really not in line with some of the very basic canons of Marxism, because Marxism ultimately will lead to the withering away of the state. Marxism is about from each according to ability to each according to needs. None of these key fundamental tenets of Marxism are part of Xi Jinping thought. Xi Jinping does not accept them. And what's also interesting is that Xi Jinping thought the national rejuvenation of China is to be successfully delivered by 2049 or 2050, basically the centenary of the founding of the centenary of the People's Republic of China. Beyond that, there is nothing. I mean, you can't really have an ideology that has an expiry date like that. So we call it in the book a proto-ideology. Be that as it may, it is still something which Xi Jinping requires in the first instance, everybody in the party, now everybody in China, or it is going to be extended to become everybody of Chinese ancestry, to learn, to embrace, and therefore have that unity of thought that will enable them to think the right thought and enable them to therefore want the same goals and work together to enable China to deliver the China dream of national rejuvenation. when Xi Jinping talked about the signification of Marxism, he does not talk about it in the way that Mao Zedong talked about it. In the Mao Zedong era, when Mao talked about the signification of Marxism-Leninism, Mao was talking about the adoption and adaptation of an urban-based proletarian revolution in the agrarian context of China, because China did not have that capitalism which were required to be in place for communism, socialism to be put in place. And China did not have that urban proletariat class to be the pioneers of the revolution. So he had to change and adapt in that context. When Xi Jinping talked about the, in quotation marks, signification of Marxism, and here he drops Leninism at all completely, even though I'm putting it to you that he is the ultimate Leninist. And when he say Marxist, he actually means Leninist. But to him, he only talked about Marxism because to him, Karl Marx matter, Mao Zedong matter, Lenin matter less. Deng Xiaoping didn't really matter. Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, they were footnotes of history. That's his kind of vision of what constitutes greatness. But going back to here, when he talked about the signification of Marxism, he is about making Marxism Sino-centric. He is talking about Marxism as the ideology developed on the basis of China's tradition and civilization and greatness, rather than acknowledging, as Mao did, that at least this is a Western import that has to be modified, adapted to fit the local context. He simply goes the other way and claim it as Chinese. But this unity of thought is something which we are seeing being pushed regularly in China on a daily basis, and is going to continue. And this is why understanding what Xi Jinping thought is supposed to be becomes more and more important. He is not seeing himself handing over power anytime soon. The fourth element of Xi Jinping thought is about upgrading the de facto social contract. In the field of studying Chinese politics, we have long talked about the existence of a de facto social contract after the Beijing massacre of 1989, that the Communist Party insists on a monopoly of power in return for promising people that they would be given a better living condition every passing year or passing month. Now, Xi Jinping is saying that that's not good enough. We need to upgrade it and make it even better. So the party promises more. It's not just about growth rate and therefore your very crude calculation of improvements in living standards. It's about the quality of this improvement. So not just growth, but high quality growth, making the Chinese economy cutting edge, making the Chinese economy innovative, making the Chinese economy competitive, and move up the value chain, not simply have people doing the low-level labor-intensive work. Even more, it's about making people in China proud. There's a mental element to it, and this is where it reinforces the ideological indoctrination, making people proud of being Chinese. And of course, here there is a monopoly in the narrative of history that it is only with the Communist Party that people in China, the Chinese people, can be proud. Without the Communist Party, you are nothing. Without the Communist Party, you are victims of Western imperialists who step over you like mud. It's the Communist Party that makes you great. It's the Communist Party that makes China great. And therefore, you must all support the party. This is part of the new social contract. It also means for the minorities, and here when the term minorities is being referred to, think not only about the ethnic and religious minorities, but also the political minorities. It's important because often it is being seen that the Chinese approach under Xi Jinping towards the ethnic minorities and the religious minorities, particularly the Muslim Uyghur people of Xinjiang, was fundamentally racist. You have people therefore criticizing the Communist Party either of committing the crime against humanity as the previous UN High Commissioner for Human Rights had done in the last hour of her time in office in her last report, or others, the London Tribunal on the Uyghurs, who would describe it as a genocide. But what were being done in Xinjiang could also be done to ethnic Han Chinese people, if you like, the political minorities of Hong Kong. The poor people of Hong Kong who were misguided by the Western black hands into believing in mistaken ideas, which they like to call in democracy. But of course, Xi Jinping will tell you that the only true democracy is the whole process democracy of China, which is vastly superior to the kind of procedural democracy practice in places like Canada or the United Kingdom and other Western countries. So from the perspective of Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, and the Chinese government, what they are doing in places like Xinjiang all the way through to Hong Kong was leveling them up into patriotic Chinese. And patriotic Chinese are defined by the cultural Han tradition and their loyalty to the Communist Party and its supreme leader. And you will have noticed that I've now changed the description of Xi Jinping from the beginning as the top leader to the supreme leader, because that's what has happened in the 11 years of Xi Jinping's rule in China. He became the top leader by the will of the Communist Party. He made himself supreme leader, not necessarily with everybody in the Communist Party being enthusiastic about it, though nobody, of course, dared to challenge that. So this is what it means in terms of the upgrading of the de facto social contract. The fifth element is about the developing a socialist market economy. It means the active state steerage of the markets to deliver maximum synergy between government guardians and market forces. And if this happens at the expense of private enterprises, so be it. But it is not an idea which is starting off as fundamentally anti-private sector. It puts more emphasis on the state-owned sector, expecting the state-owned sector to deliver this. But he does allow for the private sector to play a role, provided the private sectors, the particular private enterprises, take all the right boxes. And the best example of your private sector enterprise with all the right boxes and was rewarded for total state support would be Huawei. You being in Canada will know about the experience of Huawei's chief financial officer who was detained in Vancouver at the request of your southern neighbor, the US. And when that happened, everything, the full weight of the Chinese state were put to support her and Huawei. Not even state-owned enterprises with full ministerial rank enjoy the same level of support that Huawei did. That's because Huawei, as a private company, actually did everything the Communist Party would want a private enterprise to do. So we have to understand that when we are looking at the Xi Jinping approach to the economy, while he does by default favor the state-owned sector, he does allow for scope for the private sectors to develop, as long as the private sectors does what the party expects and requires them to do. And it is all about enhancing economic order and security, even if some of these policies sometimes turn out to deliver the opposite effect. But when that happens, the problem was always blamed on somebody else, like external forces, and not because of leadership of the party. And he also talked about the common prosperity, which is an amazing thing, considering that this is the world's most powerful socialist country, at least in principle. And no state has more power and capacity to control its society and economy than the Communist Party-run Chinese government. And yet, it has to promote a policy of common prosperity, requesting and requiring private individuals and private enterprises to play a philanthropic role as directed by the party, rather than simply doing redistribution. And that shows you how much it really is a true socialist or Marxist political system. And what the socialist market economy, in a sense, mean really is that it is putting socialism and market forces within the framework of a party-centric system. The number 6 part of Xi Jinping thought is about creating a patriotic people. A patriotic people, as I say, means somebody who is sharing the mainstream Chinese tradition and thought and being completely loyal to the party and its top or supreme leader. And that loyalty means the correct political thinking that must be there. It also means it's fundamentally xenophobic. It does not trust foreigners and foreign countries. And it also emphasized that China is a land of heroes. As long as the people follow the leadership of the party, then they are all heroes who are able to achieve things that other people cannot achieve. And the extension of Chineseness goes into the Chinese diaspora. Now, in reality, members of the Chinese diaspora are not exactly required to perform as much as citizens of the PRC. But here you have a direct contradiction of what the Chinese nationality law introduced in the Deng Xiaoping era of reform and opening says. In the Chinese nationality law, it says effectively that if you were a Chinese PRC citizen and you acquire a foreign nationality by residence in that foreign country, you would automatically lose your Chinese nationality. Xi Jinping says, it doesn't matter If you got Chinese blood running through your veins, you are Chinese, and you should be loyal to Mother China. Totally opposite against what the Chinese law says. Now, the last element I want to talk about before engaging with Lynette and you in conversations is about the ultimate goal of delivering the China dream of national rejuvenation. And the way how Xi Jinping described it is that it is to build a common destiny for humankind. And he builds a common destiny for humankind by advocating the three global initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. Now, what does all this jargon mean? What it means is essentially that China does not try to outcompete the United States in the current liberal international order, which, from the Chinese government's perspective, was created by the West at the end of the Second World War into a system which would best be described as a system of the West, by the West, and for the West. And a Cold War 2.0 scenario with China winning, which still means China playing by the rules laid down by the Americans and try to outcompete the Americans on American terms. No, they don't want to do that. They want something else. They want to change the rules of the game because fundamentally they see the rules of the games are wrong. The liberal international order as undemocratic. He wants to use the institutions of liberal international order, the existing international organizations from the UN through your IMF, World Banks, and other institutions to transform them from inside, to make them, in quotation marks, more democratic. How does he do that? Well, you do, of course, know that the democratic West, whatever that means, is by definition a minority. Most countries in the world are not democracies, at least not Western-styled democracies, not in practice anyway. The overwhelming majority of people in the world lived in the global South, not in the democratic West. The overwhelming number of countries in the world belongs to the global South, not to the democratic West. And Xi Jinping say China is forever a part of the global South. And Xi Jinping focused on cultivating the global South through the Belt and Road Initiative with development loans, lending them money on projects that your regular international development agencies would not lend, that your Western donor countries would not provide money for. China will provide them with loans and assistance for those projects. In return, China asks only for one, the lion's shares of contracts for those projects, which is a common requirement anyway. And secondly, total support for China's position on Taiwan. And third, this is something that most of us have missed out, support for China's position at the United Nations and other international organizations for the democratization of the international system and the international order, so that China can represent them to put their interests at the top of the agenda and in the international system and organizations, and make sure those interests are being looked after. Now, what is there not to like if you were an autocrat running a country in the global South? Does have certain appeal. What comes across to us as ideological or rhetorical mumbo-jumbo actually has appeal in large parts of the world. And with that support, China can change how the UN's and other international organizations functions. We already seen it, for example, in how the Human Rights Council operates in China. And there are many other examples. I think I've spoken a bit longer than I thought I would do. So I will stop here, hand it back to Professor Ong.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was very interesting. So, I mean, I have kind of read and heard bits and pieces of it from various places, but I think your book has really done a great job in articulating it systematically and pulling in the different threads. So I really want to commend you and Olivia for doing that. So my question is, several thoughts come to my mind. How do you think, what degree of success do you think Xi Jinping has achieved in terms of various dimensions of his political thoughts, starting with the upgrading of the de facto social contract from one that is focusing merely on GDP growth to one that focuses on high quality growth? To what extent is the Chinese people buying into that? I mean, we see really sputtering growth rate in the last couple of years. You have got huge industrial growth in energy sector, in green energy, in EV, but real estate and construction, everything falling flat. So to what extent do people actually buy into kind of the new social contract, especially in the post-pandemic world, post-pandemic in China, given what it has done in terms of the sudden the reversal of the zero COVID policy, and kind of correspondingly, so what you say about kind of delivering national rejuvenation with the BRI, giving out loans in exchange for loyalty for its support for China's position on Taiwan and United Nations, it's also very interesting. So the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore just put out a report yesterday surveying elites in the region, each and every country in Southeast Asia. These are academic think tanks, government officials, civil society, private sector leaders, so on and so forth. Ask them a range of questions, basically trying to probe whether they are more pro-China or pro-United States. You know, this is a region that is at the backyard of the juggernaut and traditionally quite pro-United States. So people have been very reluctant to pick side. But I think in the last couple of years, there has been a trend of shifting away from the United States and moving towards China, even when China has gotten more authoritarian under Xi Jinping. I think that is interesting. I mean, I think it used to be about 60 pro-US and 40 pro-China 10 years ago. These days is about 59 and 41. So much more balanced. But if you look at Pew survey, which surveys the people on the ground, that is overwhelmingly pro-China, which is in stark contrast with Pew survey results in Canada, United States, and I think in Britain too, which is very anti-China. So I think, you know, I don't know what thoughts you have in terms of that. You could see that a lot of Southeast Asian countries have been the recipient of BRI. It's interesting, at least from my perspective, to see that shift. I would leave it here and hear your thoughts, and I've got more questions, but anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Lynette. Really great questions. Do people buy the new social contract? Okay, if I could be a bit naughty, let me divide the answer into two parts. If you ask, do people support this new de facto social contract by, say, 2019? I would say if China were to have full and fair and open elections in 2019, Xi Jinping would have won with an enormous landslide genuinely. I think there's very little question that if we're looking at 2019, he would have won without really serious difficulties in a genuinely open, fair elections. I think that kind of gave you a sense of how much momentum he was building up to. Even though I would also add that even for 2019, he would probably face more resistance within the Communist Party than he would in the country at large. But if we are asking the same question of 2024, I don't think we can be quite as certain that he would be able to win with a landslide. He probably would still win. Almost certainly, I think he would still win office in fair open elections in China today. But a landslide? Probably not. You mentioned about zero COVID and the reversal of zero COVID. I think that had a huge impact on how people thought about it. Because the one big difference in the Xi Jinping era of politics and policy from previously was the substitution or replacement of collective leadership up to the beginning of the Xi Jinping era by the existence of a strongman rule in polite language or dictatorship by 2017, 2018. After the first 19-party Congress, after Xi Jinping consolidated power, he effectively reduced the top echelon of the Communist Party into an echo chamber. And policy mistakes started to be made significantly in numbers and in magnitude. And the zero COVID and the reversal of zero COVID was just the most extreme demonstration of that kind of errors. Whereas if you look at the record of the Communist Party from 1990, right after the year after the Beijing massacre, when communism had collapsed in Eastern Europe and was in trouble in the Soviet Union, to say 2012, the parties, they had not made one major policy mistake that could potentially destabilize its hold to power. We can't say the same necessarily since then. And that is reflected in how people are being not so comfortable about him any longer. And the same also, of course, applies to the post-pandemic economic management. But a lot of those economic problems were in place even without the pandemic, before the pandemic. They were just not quite so acute as the post-pandemic changes have unleashed, as Xi Jinping's attempts to sort out some of the economic problems like the bubble situation with the property market. It was completely well-intentioned. He tried to engineer a soft landing of the property market, which most of us have said should have been done in China for at least 10, 20 years. He finally got around to do it, but then he did it in a way that basically deflated the bubble, and therefore the economy is in serious trouble. And he hasn't got a good plans to get out of it. And he's also reshuffled the top end of the economic management teams that he doesn't have people to do that. So there is that problem there. To your second question about the Southeast Asian opinions, I think Southeast Asia is such a diverse area and range of countries. You have very, very diverse views in Southeast Asia, but where you do have in common is a certain bandwagoning effect. When the Chinese are building up that momentum, and America is so far away, in the post-Trump era, when reliability of Uncle Sam is being openly questioned on justifiable grounds, your rich elite in Southeast Asia would want to be playing very safe with the Chinese, whatever they think privately. They wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of it, because if things comes to blow, if the Americans don't win and has staying power, they will still have to live with China. And that is, of course, in addition to the effect of the Chinese rhetoric for the global South, which was more designed for Africa and the Middle East than for Southeast Asia. But it still applied to Southeast Asia. There are large parts of Southeast Asia which would be willing to engage with that Chinese rhetoric and find it attractive. Not in all Southeast Asian countries, but even for your frontline states in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, much as it is wanting to cozy up to the United States, it doesn't want to be on the wrong side of China either. And they are not exactly buddies of China, in spite of the sharing of a similar political system and somewhat similar ideology. And I think that kind of explains why we do need to take the Chinese rise seriously, even though Xi Jinping is managing it very poorly. Back to you.
Very interesting thought. So let's open up for question. Question from Alexandra Volkov. In China, there are now many children of Black fathers and Chinese mothers. How will Xi Jinping deal with them?
Well, Xi Jinping will say that as long as they are patriotic Chinese, that's fine. But I'm a Chinese person, so I hope I can say this without appearing to have a particular prejudice. But Chinese society fundamentally remains not colorblind, and there are general practices of discrimination against people of darker complexion. The darker it is, the greater the discrimination there is. So if you are looking at children born of Black father and Chinese mother, they are not being put on a level playing field in terms of their capacity to develop a career. And Xi Jinping will deny that such things ever exist in China, because if they are good Chinese, then they're okay. Except that that doesn't change the reality. There's nothing in Xi Jinping thought, or in the party's policy, or in the Chinese government's policy, that genuinely respect people of huge diversity. Your Uyghur or your Tibetans are required, on the one hand, to behave and think and be like mainstream Chinese, like the Han. But when they do so and try to check into a hotel in Beijing or Shanghai, they do not get treated the same way as your regular Han visitors from a different province. And you will have the same problem, I think, when you're dealing with children, young people of mixed parentage still.
Sure. Question from Peter Remish. Could you please elaborate on the idea of Hong Kongers minorities within China?
Well, Hong Kongers as minorities is as political minority because they believe in ideas which are not in line with the mainstream ideas in China, or for that matter, Xi Jinping thought. So if people in Hong Kong believed in Western-style democracy and the narrative of human rights as it is being used in the democratic West, which you have many people in Hong Kong who do, then they are in that sense political minorities, because they are not on the main part of the mainstream, and that's why they need to be help, according to Xi Jinping thought, to become mainstream patriotic Chinese. And I think that's what they actually meant. They are not being treated quite the same way as the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That's partly because Hong Kong is a very special place. Hong Kong is very visible to the outside world, even with the level of control that the party states now exercise in Hong Kong. It cannot completely avoid outside scrutiny in the way that they could more or less just about manage to do in Xinjiang.
Sure. And a question from an anonymous attendee. So you differentiate between the CCP and the state. Is the state not just a tool to implement the policies of the CCP? That is the state just a branch of the party?
Well, making a distinction between the state and the party doesn't mean the state is not subjugated to the party. I mean, particularly under Xi Jinping. We did see for about 4 decades in the reform and opening of the Deng Xiaoping era, when the party was, by agreement, playing a less directly interfering roles in how the government departments operate. And now Xi Jinping is reversing that and putting the party completely in control, to the extent that some of your state institutions are effectively being merged into the state, the party-run parts of it. So yes, the state institutions are now mostly for implementation, but making that distinction still matters. A lot would depend on how long Xi Jinping lives. If Xi Jinping does not live that long, whoever takes over from him may well want to go back to the Deng Xiaoping era's approach and try to separate the state from the party more and allow more scope for the state institutions to be running it as part of the Chinese government, even though it's being dominated by the Communist Party, which is still different from the state institutions effectively only obeying orders from the Communist Party.
Okay, so the same person asked whether there will be recording of the event. Yes, there will be recording, which will be uploaded to YouTube, so please watch out for that. Let me go to the question. So how will the emerging China-India rivalry and India's increasing closeness with the US shape the dynamics in Southeast Asia and otherwise?
Well, the competition between China and India, I think, is an extremely important and interesting one. I think the real importance in that relationship is not so much in terms of how much India is getting closer to the United States, because if we are looking at the huge difficulties between China and the United States, the biggest problem ultimately will be over Taiwan. When Xi Jinping decides to take Taiwan and the Taiwanese decides not to surrender, and Xi Jinping uses force, the Americans get involved militarily, where would the Indians be? I mean, the chance of India being militarily involved, I think, is very, very small. However you define the involvement is. But where India really plays a very, very important competitive role is in the engagement with the Global South. China under Xi Jinping may say that China is forever part of the Global South, implying that China is the natural leader of the Global South. You try the argument in Delhi, it's not going to get very far. I don't think there are many Indians who will buy into that narrative. Even not under Prime Minister Modi, India would see itself as more like a natural leader of the Global South rather than does not have to be necessarily the leader of the Global South, but certainly a leader of the Global South, which would provide a significant counterbalance to the Chinese claim that they can actually be the leader of the Global South. Because the bigger ambition that Xi Jinping has require China winning support from the Global South to deliver his China dream.
Okay, and a question from Linda Salman. Could you dig a bit deeper into Xi's concept and execution of democracy in China and the Global South?
Well, the Chinese concept of the I'm not entirely sure I get the question completely right, because I'm trying to see whether you're really asking me how the Chinese look at the democratization of the international system with the support of the Global South, rather than the democratization of the Global South. Because the Chinese are not really talking a lot about the democratization of the Global South. They are simply talking about we are all part of the Global South, disadvantaged and disregarded for much too long by the privileged democratic West, who took us for granted and did not give us proper treatment and respect. And the democratization of that international system is to make sure that countries from the Global South have their say in global affairs through the international organizations, in particular the United Nations. And with that, it means that the preeminence of the Western countries and Western interests in the liberal international order would be replaced by a system of international system that pays more respect for countries in the Global South and people in the Global South. And therefore, Western countries like the United States would no longer have the right to tell countries in the Global South that your system of government, your autocratic system of government, is wrong, and you need to have a democratic system of government, that your way of dealing with your citizens do not sufficiently respect human rights, and you have to do it the way we do it in the US, North America, or Europe. Is that kind of arguments being put forward. And the Chinese are basically saying that when we become number one, we won't tell you what to do. And that is what the Global Civilization Initiative is talking about. No country has the right to tell another country how to live their lives and govern themselves and what systems to have. Every system, every culture, every civilization is equally important. So if you have a system that allows you to treat your own citizens in ways that are not approved of by the democratic West, you have that right, and that right cannot be taken away from you, and China will defend you with your right in that regard. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. And I think that's a good note to end the webinar. I think that's all we have the time for. Thank you so much, Steve, for a really interesting conversation. And thank you everyone for coming. And I hope your book is selling like hotcakes everywhere.
Well, thank you very much, Lynette, and thank you to you all for your questions and for listening. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.